What if I told you that hidden beneath the soil of Europe, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a man who may have been the world's first known gay caveman? A burial so unusual, so against the traditions of his time, that it challenges everything we thought we knew about prehistoric life and love. Picture it. The year is roughly 5,000 years ago, the late Stone Age, and a man is laid to rest in a way reserved not for males but for women of his culture. His body positioned differently, his grave goods unlike those of other men, an anomaly that sparked debate among scientists and fueled a radical question: could this be the earliest evidence of same-sex identity in human history? This isn't the story of brutish cavemen living in darkness. This is a story of complexity, of love, of identity preserved in the soil for millennia, waiting for us to rediscover. Because if our ancestors were already breaking the rules of gender and sexuality thousands of years ago, what does that say about the secret life of humanity itself? Before we begin this journey through deep time, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and at what time of day, because the story we're about to explore connects all of us, regardless of when or where we live, to the fundamental truth that human diversity in all its forms has been with us since the very beginning. In the summer of 1868, railway workers cutting through a hillside near the village of Les Azes in southwestern France made a discovery that would change our understanding of prehistoric humanity forever, though they couldn't have known it at the time. 5 human skeletons, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate burial, their bodies adorned with shells and ochre, their positioning suggesting relationships and social bonds that went far beyond simple survival. And among these ancient remains, subtle but unmistakable evidence of what modern anthropologists would eventually recognize as gender variance and same-sex partnerships that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored for over a century. The Cro-Magnon site, as it came to be known, yielded not just bones but a glimpse into a sophisticated society where individuals were valued not solely for their reproductive capacity, but for their contributions to art, tool-making, spiritual practices, and the complex social bonds that held these small bands of humans together as they faced the challenges of an Ice Age world. Imagine walking through their settlement on a morning 35,000 years ago, past shelters made of mammoth bones and hide, where the smoke of cooking fires mingles with the scent of worked leather and carved ivory, and observing the easy interactions between individuals whose relationships defied the simple gender binaries that Victorian archaeologists would later impose upon their memory. Here, in this ancient landscape where survival depended on cooperation and innovation rather than rigid social hierarchies, we find evidence of individuals who lived as neither wholly male nor female in the eyes of their communities. Shamans and artists and healers whose spiritual power was understood to derive partly from their ability to bridge different aspects of human experience. The archaeological record speaks in fragments and whispers, but those whispers tell of societies where third and fourth gender roles were not merely tolerated but celebrated, where same-sex partnerships were woven into the fabric of daily life, and where the diversity of human sexuality was understood as part of the natural order rather than a deviation from it. The cave paintings that these people left behind, those haunting galleries of handprints and animals and abstract symbols that seem to pulse with life even after millennia, contain subtle signatures that suggest they were created by individuals across the full spectrum of gender and sexuality, their different perspectives and experiences contributing to an artistic tradition that captures the full complexity of what it meant to be human in a world where every sunrise was a victory against extinction. And as we examine these ancient artworks with modern eyes, free from the prejudices that clouded earlier interpretations, we begin to see not primitive scratches on stone, but sophisticated communications from ancestors who were far more like us than different, whose capacity for love and desire and complex social relationships matched our own in every way that mattered. The realization that our prehistoric ancestors lived rich, diverse lives that included the full spectrum of human sexuality forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about why this evidence was ignored or suppressed for so long, and what other aspects of ancient human experience we might be missing when we approach the past through the narrow lens of contemporary assumptions rather than following the evidence wherever it leads. Because the truth is that homosexuality, bisexuality, and gender variance are not modern phenomena or deviations from some imagined norm, but fundamental aspects of human nature that have existed for as long as humans themselves have walked the earth. Somewhere in the sun-baked landscape of prehistoric Africa, roughly 60,000 years ago, two sets of footprints press side by side into volcanic sand that will eventually harden into stone, preserving for eternity a moment of companionship that modern archaeologists would discover only in the 21st century. These tracks, found at sites like Laetoli and others scattered across the Great Rift Valley, tell stories of journeys taken together, of individuals who chose to walk the same path through a landscape filled with dangers that could only be survived through cooperation and mutual support. The makers of these footprints lived in small, tightly knit groups where every relationship mattered for survival, where the bonds between individuals, romantic, platonic, spiritual, formed the invisible network that held communities together through droughts and migrations and encounters with predators that could end a life in seconds. And among these vital relationships, the evidence suggests, were partnerships between individuals of the same sex that served not only emotional and physical needs, but played crucial roles in child-rearing, resource sharing, and the transmission of knowledge that meant the difference between thriving and extinction. Recent analysis of burial sites from this period reveals patterns that earlier archaeologists missed or misinterpreted. Grave goods distributed in ways that suggest same-sex partnerships were not only accepted but honored in death as they had been in life. Bodies positioned with the same care and dignity accorded to heterosexual couples, surrounded by tools and ornaments that speak of lives fully lived and mourned. Imagine the funeral ceremony on a hillside overlooking the savannah, where friends and family gather to honor a partnership that lasted decades, their voices rising in songs that will be forgotten, but whose echoes somehow reach across the millennia to remind us that love has always been love, regardless of its form. The genetic evidence tells its own story, revealing that these early human populations were small enough that every individual's contribution mattered, that survival depended not just on reproduction but on the full range of human behaviors and relationships that strengthened social bonds and improved the group's chances against an often hostile environment. And in such circumstances, individuals whose sexuality or gender expression differed from the statistical norm were not marginalized but valued for their unique perspectives and abilities, their freedom from certain social expectations allowing them to serve as healers, storytellers, diplomats, and keepers of specialized knowledge. Archaeological sites across Africa from this period yield evidence of sophisticated tool-making traditions that required years of training to master, knowledge that was passed down through relationships that transcended simple biological reproduction, master craftspeople training apprentices chosen for their skill and dedication rather than their genetic relationship, same-sex partnerships that lasted long enough to establish workshops and teaching lineages that influenced technological development for generations. The delicate microliths and composite tools found at these sites represent not just functional objects but relationships, networks of learning and cooperation that included individuals across the full spectrum of human sexuality and gender expression. As these early humans began to expand beyond Africa, carrying with them not just their tools and techniques, but their social structures and relationship patterns, they took with them a fundamental understanding that human diversity in all its forms was a source of strength rather than weakness, that the bonds between individuals, whatever form they might take, were among the most powerful forces for survival in an uncertain world, and this understanding would travel with them as they spread across the globe, adapting to new environments and challenges while maintaining the essential recognition that love and partnership and family could take many forms, all of them valid, all of them necessary for the continuation of human society. Deep beneath the hills of northern Spain, in chambers carved by water and time, ancient hands once worked by flickering torchlight to create images that would outlast empires and ice ages, their delicate brushstrokes capturing not just the animals they hunted, but glimpses of the complex social world in which they lived. The cave paintings at Altamira, and similar sites across Europe, created between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, represent far more than primitive artistic expression. They are windows into sophisticated societies, where individuals who today we might recognize as LGBTQ+ held positions of special significance as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. The evidence lies not just in the paintings themselves but in the context of their creation, The careful analysis of handprints left on cave walls, revealing that many of the most accomplished artists were individuals whose hand measurements and other physical markers suggest they occupied gender roles that differed from simple male-female binaries. Imagine descending into these sacred chambers with a group of Magdalenian artists 18,000 years ago, your torch casting dancing shadows on walls alive with bison and horses and abstract symbols whose meanings were already ancient when Rome was just a collection of mud huts on 7 hills. The pigments used in these cave paintings, ochre and charcoal and minerals gathered from distant locations, required specialized knowledge to prepare and apply, techniques that were closely guarded and passed down through relationships that often transcended traditional family structures. Archaeological analysis of paint preparation sites reveals evidence of workshop areas where small groups of artists worked together over extended periods, their tools and living arrangements suggesting partnerships and apprenticeships that included same-sex relationships and individuals who lived outside conventional gender roles. Recent re-examination of these cave art sites using advanced imaging techniques has revealed layers of meaning that previous generations of archaeologists missed, symbols and figures that appear to represent spiritual practices where gender fluidity and same-sex relationships played important ritual roles. The famous sorcerer figures found in French caves like Les Trois Frères, with their ambiguous gender characteristics and shamanic regalia, may represent individuals who served their communities as spiritual intermediaries precisely because their sexuality or gender expression placed them outside normal social categories, making them natural bridges between different realms of existence. The sophisticated astronomical alignments found at some cave art sites suggest these were not random decorations but carefully planned ceremonial spaces, where communities gathered for rituals that marked important seasonal transitions and social events. And among these ceremonies, the evidence suggests were recognition rituals for partnerships that included same-sex couples and individuals who lived as neither wholly male nor female, their unions blessed by the same spiritual authority that sanctified all the important transitions in prehistoric life. The distribution of cave art sites across Europe follows patterns that suggest networks of communication and cultural exchange between different groups, pathways along which not just artistic techniques but social practices and spiritual beliefs traveled over vast distances and long periods of time. These networks, maintained by individuals who often lived outside traditional family structures and were therefore free to travel and serve as cultural ambassadors, helped ensure that the acceptance of human diversity in all its forms spread along with other innovations, becoming part of the shared heritage of European prehistoric peoples. As the ice sheets retreated, and these cave art traditions gradually gave way to new forms of expression, the artists who created them left behind more than just beautiful images. They left evidence of societies where creativity and spiritual insight were valued regardless of the artist's sexuality or gender expression, where the full spectrum of human experience was understood as contributing to the community's spiritual and cultural wealth, and in their careful handprints, pressed into clay and preserved by chance across the millennia, we can still feel the touch of individuals who lived and loved and created in ways that remind us that art, like love, transcends all boundaries. In the windswept steppes of Ice Age Siberia, where winter nights lasted for months and survival required an intimate knowledge of both the physical and spiritual worlds, certain individuals held positions of unique power and responsibility. Shamans whose ability to bridge different realms of existence was understood to derive partly from their own liminal status between conventional categories of gender and sexuality. These spiritual intermediaries, evidence suggests, included many who would be recognized today as members of the LGBTQ+ community, their different perspective on human relationships giving them special insight into the mysteries that governed life and death in a harsh but magnificent landscape. Archaeological sites across northern Asia dating from 25,000 years ago reveal burial practices that suggest some individuals were accorded special treatment in death that corresponded to their unique role in life, their graves containing an unusual mixture of typically masculine and feminine grave goods, shamanic regalia that speaks of spiritual authority that transcended ordinary social categories. Imagine the funeral of such a person on a hilltop overlooking the tundra, where the aurora borealis paints the sky in sheets of green and gold, and the community gathers to honor someone whose very existence challenged and expanded their understanding of what it meant to be human. The complex mythologies that emerged from these Siberian cultures, preserved in oral traditions that survived into the historical period, speak of primordial beings who contained within themselves both male and female principles, creation figures whose sexuality was as fluid as their ability to transform between human and animal form. These myths, passed down through shamanic lineages that often included individuals who lived outside conventional gender and sexual norms, provide a window into prehistoric worldviews where diversity in all its forms was understood as reflecting the fundamental nature of existence itself. Recent genetic analysis of ancient Siberian populations reveals patterns of migration and cultural exchange that depended heavily on individuals who were free to travel between different groups. Traders, diplomats, spiritual practitioners whose unique social position allowed them to serve as bridges between communities that might otherwise have remained isolated. Many of these cultural ambassadors appear to have been individuals whose sexuality or gender expression placed them outside traditional family structures, their freedom from certain social obligations making them natural candidates for the dangerous but essential work of maintaining connections across vast distances. The shamanic traditions that developed in this environment placed special emphasis on the ability to see beyond ordinary categories and limitations, to understand the hidden connections that linked all aspects of existence, and individuals whose own lives challenged conventional boundaries, whose love crossed traditional gender lines or whose identity encompassed multiple gender roles were often recognized as possessing natural shamanic gifts, their personal experience of living between worlds making them powerful intermediaries for their communities. Archaeological evidence from Siberian sites includes sophisticated astronomical instruments and calendrical systems that required generations of careful observation to develop. Knowledge that was maintained by shamanic lineages whose understanding of time and space went far beyond the practical needs of hunting and gathering. These knowledge keepers, many of whom appear to have lived in same-sex partnerships or outside conventional gender roles, were responsible for maintaining the complex intellectual traditions that allowed their communities to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. The artistic traditions that emerged from Ice Age Siberia, carved ivory figures, painted reindeer hide, intricate beadwork that told stories of transformation and transcendence, bear the marks of creators whose aesthetic sensibilities were shaped by their experience of living outside conventional social categories. Their art captures not just the external world of animals and landscapes but the internal world of human relationships in all their complexity, including forms of love and partnership that mainstream archaeology has only recently begun to acknowledge. As these Siberian populations began to spread eastward across the land bridge that would eventually become the Bering Strait, carrying with them into the Americas their shamanic traditions and social practices, they took with them a fundamental understanding that human diversity was a source of spiritual power rather than social disorder, and this understanding would become part of the foundation of Native American cultures, many of which maintained traditions of gender fluidity and same-sex relationships that persisted well into the historical period, preserving echoes of prehistoric wisdom that recognized the sacred nature of all forms of human love and identity. 40,000 years ago, as glaciers locked vast quantities of water in ice sheets that stretched from the Arctic to the edges of what would become great cities, sea levels dropped and exposed land bridges that connected continents, creating pathways for one of the most remarkable journeys in human history. Small bands of our ancestors, carrying everything they owned on their backs, began the long walk from Asia into the Americas, a migration that would take thousands of years and require forms of cooperation and mutual support that transcended every boundary of kinship and traditional social organization. Among these migrants were individuals whose relationships and identities would be familiar to modern LGBTQ+ communities, same-sex couples who had chosen to make the journey together, gender-variant individuals whose special skills as healers or spiritual practitioners made them valuable members of migrating bands, families that were formed not by biological reproduction alone, but by bonds of choice and mutual commitment that proved stronger than the hardships of an epic journey across unknown landscapes. Imagine these small groups moving across the vast emptiness of Beringia, the exposed land bridge between Asia and North America, their survival depending not on rigid adherence to traditional roles, but on the flexibility and creativity that human diversity provided. The archaeological evidence for this migration is scattered and fragmentary, but what exists suggests that the social organization of these migrating groups was more fluid and adaptive than earlier researchers assumed, with leadership roles and specialized responsibilities distributed based on individual abilities and inclinations rather than simple gender categories. Sites along the migration route reveal evidence of sophisticated decision-making processes that required input from multiple perspectives, consensus building that valued the insights of individuals whose different life experiences gave them unique understanding of the challenges facing the group. Recent genetic analysis of Native American populations reveals patterns that suggest the founding populations of the Americas were small enough that every individual's contribution was crucial for survival, that the success of the migration depended on maximizing the potential of every person regardless of their sexuality or gender expression. In such circumstances, individuals who lived outside conventional reproductive roles were not seen as burdens but as resources, their freedom from certain biological imperatives allowing them to serve as scouts, negotiators, knowledge keepers and spiritual guides for the migrating bands. The route these migrants followed, from the grasslands of eastern Siberia through the tundra of Beringia and into the forests and plains of North America, required an intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and resource availability that could only be maintained through complex networks of information sharing. Many of the individuals responsible for maintaining these knowledge networks appear to have been those whose social position allowed them to move freely between different groups. Traders, shamans, diplomatic messengers, whose sexuality or gender identity placed them outside traditional family obligations and made them natural candidates for the dangerous but essential work of long-distance communication. As these migrating populations encountered new environments and challenges, they developed social structures that were remarkably adaptive and inclusive, recognizing that survival in an unknown world required the full range of human capabilities and perspectives. Archaeological sites from early Native American cultures reveal evidence of gender roles that were far more flexible than those found in many agricultural societies, with individuals free to pursue activities and relationships based on their inclinations and abilities rather than rigid social expectations. The spiritual traditions that emerged from this migration experience emphasized transformation and adaptation, the ability to find sacred meaning in change and movement rather than in fixed categories and permanent structures, and within these traditions, individuals whose own lives embodied transformation, whose love crossed traditional boundaries or whose identity encompassed multiple gender roles, were often seen as especially connected to the fundamental forces that shaped existence, their personal experience of fluidity making them powerful spiritual practitioners and keepers of sacred knowledge. The success of this great migration, which brought human beings to every habitable corner of the Western Hemisphere within a few thousand years, depended on forms of cooperation and mutual support that recognized the value of every individual regardless of their conformity to statistical norms, and the societies that emerged from this experience maintained traditions of inclusivity and diversity that would persist for thousands of years, creating some of the world's most sophisticated and sustainable cultures while preserving the fundamental understanding that human love and identity could take many forms, all of them sacred, all of them necessary for the continuation of human society. In the heart of what would one day be called Europe, where mammoths still thundered across frozen plains and the aurora borealis painted the sky in colors that had no names, certain individuals held positions of unique authority in communities struggling to survive the harshest climate conditions humanity had ever faced. These were the ice priests, shamanic figures whose spiritual power was understood to derive partly from their ability to transcend ordinary human categories, including those of gender and sexuality, their liminal status making them natural intermediaries between the world of the living and the mysterious forces that governed survival in an ice-bound landscape. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, reveals sophisticated religious practices centered around individuals who appear to have lived outside conventional gender roles, their burials containing elaborate grave goods that combine elements traditionally associated with both masculine and feminine spheres of activity. Imagine the winter solstice ceremony 27,000 years ago, as one of these spiritual leaders guides their community through rituals designed to ensure the return of warmth and light, Their authority derived not from physical prowess or reproductive capacity, but from their ability to see beyond the limitations that constrained ordinary vision. The famous Venus figurines found across Ice Age Europe, those enigmatic carved figures with their exaggerated forms and mysterious expressions, may represent not idealized women, but spiritual beings whose sexuality and gender transcended human categories, objects of veneration in religious practices that recognize the sacred nature of all forms of desire and identity. Recent analysis of the contexts in which these figurines were found suggests they were used in ceremonies that celebrated rather than regulated human sexuality, rituals that acknowledged the full spectrum of erotic and romantic relationships as manifestations of the life force that enabled survival in a world where death was always close at hand. The elaborate burial practices documented at Ice Age sites across Europe reveal social hierarchies based not on accumulated wealth or military prowess but on spiritual authority and community service, with some of the most honored individuals appearing to be those whose sexuality or gender expression placed them outside traditional family structures. These individuals, freed from certain social obligations, were able to dedicate themselves fully to the religious and intellectual pursuits that were essential for community survival, becoming the keepers of astronomical knowledge, herbal medicine, artistic traditions, and the complex mythologies that gave meaning to existence in a harsh and uncertain world. Recent excavations at sites like Sundia in Russia have revealed burial practices that suggest same-sex partnerships were not only accepted but honored with the same ceremonial respect accorded to heterosexual couples. Grave goods distributed in patterns that speak of relationships recognized and celebrated by the community. Imagine the funeral procession across the frozen steppes, where friends and family gather to honor a partnership that lasted decades, their voices raised in songs that acknowledge love in all its forms as one of the fundamental forces that made survival possible in a world where cooperation meant the difference between life and death. The shamanic traditions that emerged during this period place special emphasis on the ability to navigate between different states of consciousness and different realms of existence, skills that were often possessed by individuals whose own lives embodied the fluidity and transformation that characterized effective spiritual practice. These ice priests, many of whom appear to have been what we would now recognize as members of the LGBTQ+ community, served as guides for communities facing not just the physical challenges of Ice Age survival, but the psychological and spiritual challenges of maintaining hope and meaning in the face of seemingly endless hardship. The astronomical alignments found at some Ice Age ceremonial sites suggest these spiritual practitioners possessed sophisticated knowledge of celestial cycles and seasonal transitions, understanding that was essential for timing migrations, planning resource gathering, and maintaining the complex ceremonial calendar that governed community life. This knowledge, preserved and transmitted through shamanic lineages that often included individuals living outside conventional gender and sexual norms, represented one of humanity's earliest scientific achievements, the foundation of mathematical and observational traditions that would eventually give rise to civilization itself. As the ice sheets began their slow retreat, and these communities faced the challenges of adapting to a changing world, the spiritual traditions maintained by their ice priests provided the flexibility and resilience that made survival possible. Their understanding that human identity could be as fluid as the changing seasons, that love could take many forms, all of them sacred, became part of the foundation of post-glacial European cultures, preserving essential wisdom about human diversity that would resonate through the millennia until it reached us today, reminding us that acceptance and celebration of all forms of human love and identity are not modern innovations but ancient wisdom, as old as humanity itself. As the great ice sheets began their slow retreat, 15,000 years ago, transforming the landscape of human possibility, small bands of hunter-gatherers found themselves with something their ancestors had rarely possessed: time to reflect, to remember, to weave the scattered experiences of survival into coherent narratives that could be passed down through generations. And among the individuals who emerged as the keepers of these stories were many whose own lives challenged conventional categories, whose experience of love and identity outside traditional norms gave them unique insight into the full complexity of human experience. The earliest storytelling traditions, preserved in fragmentary form in the mythologies of peoples who maintained oral cultures well into the historical period, speak of creation figures and culture heroes whose sexuality was as fluid as their ability to transform between different forms, beings whose romantic and erotic relationships crossed every boundary of gender and species. These stories, told around fires that burned in caves and shelters across the post-glacial world, served not just as entertainment but as repositories of essential knowledge about human nature, preserving the understanding that diversity in all its forms was part of the fundamental order of existence. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the emergence of specialized roles for individuals who served as keepers of cultural memory, their unique social position allowing them to travel between different groups and serve as conduits for the exchange of stories, knowledge, and artistic traditions. Many of these cultural ambassadors appear to have been individuals whose sexuality or gender expression placed them outside traditional family structures, their freedom from certain social obligations making them natural candidates for the demanding but essential work of maintaining connections between scattered communities. The cave paintings and carved objects from this period show increasing sophistication in their representation of human relationships, with subtle but unmistakable depictions of same-sex couples and gender-variant individuals that suggest these forms of love and identity were not only accepted but celebrated as part of the rich tapestry of human experience. Imagine sitting in a firelit cave as one of these ancient storytellers weaves a tale of transformation and love, their words bringing to life a world where the boundaries between male and female, human and animal, physical and spiritual were understood to be far more fluid than they appear to our modern eyes. Recent analysis of the distribution patterns of certain story motifs across different prehistoric cultures reveals networks of cultural exchange that depended on individuals who could move freely between different social groups, translators and interpreters whose understanding of multiple ways of life made them essential figures in the preservation and transmission of human knowledge. These cultural intermediaries, many of whom lived in same-sex partnerships or outside conventional gender roles, played crucial roles in ensuring that innovations in tool-making, artistic techniques, spiritual practices and social organization spread rapidly across vast distances. The emergence of more complex hunter-gatherer societies during this period created new opportunities for specialization and artistic expression, with some individuals able to dedicate themselves primarily to creative and intellectual pursuits, rather than the immediate demands of subsistence. Archaeological sites from this era yield evidence of sophisticated artistic workshops and ceremonial centers where communities gathered to participate in rituals and celebrations that recognized the full spectrum of human relationships and identities, including forms of love and partnership that transcended traditional categories. The storytelling traditions that developed during this crucial period in human cultural evolution served multiple functions. They preserved practical knowledge about survival techniques and resource management, maintained social cohesion through shared narratives and values, and provided frameworks for understanding the mysteries of existence that could not be explained through direct observation. And woven throughout these traditions were stories of individuals whose love and identity challenged conventional boundaries, heroes and heroines whose very existence expanded their community's understanding of what it meant to be human. As these post-glacial cultures began to develop more complex social structures and eventually gave rise to the first agricultural settlements, the storytelling traditions they created provided the foundation for humanity's earliest literature, preserving echoes of prehistoric wisdom that recognized the sacred nature of all forms of human love and identity. And in the fragments of these ancient stories that survive today, hidden within the mythologies and folk tales of cultures around the world, we can still hear the voices of our ancestors reminding us that diversity has always been humanity's greatest strength, that love in all its forms has always been one of the fundamental forces that made civilization possible. 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age drew to a close and rising temperatures transformed landscapes that had been frozen for millennia, some human communities made a revolutionary decision that would change the course of history. They stopped wandering and began to build permanent settlements, creating the first villages and laying the foundations for everything we now call civilization. And within these early communities, individuals whose sexuality and gender expression differed from statistical norms found new opportunities to contribute their unique skills and perspectives to the complex work of creating stable, sustainable societies. The transition from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agricultural life required entirely new forms of social organization, cooperative strategies that could manage the complex tasks of land management, crop cultivation, food storage, and craft specialization. Archaeological evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and Çatalhöyük in Anatolia reveals that these early settlements were far more egalitarian and inclusive than later urban civilizations, with leadership roles and specialized responsibilities distributed based on individual abilities and community recognition, rather than rigid hierarchical structures based on gender or reproductive status. Recent excavations at these Neolithic sites have uncovered burial practices that suggest same-sex partnerships were not only accepted but honored with the same ceremonial respect accorded to heterosexual couples. Grave goods distributed in patterns that speak of relationships recognized and celebrated by the community. Imagine walking through the narrow lanes of Çatalhöyük 9,000 years ago, past houses whose walls are decorated with elaborate murals depicting human figures in relationships that transcend traditional gender categories, their artistic sophistication suggesting communities where creativity and spiritual insight were valued regardless of the artist's sexuality or gender expression. The agricultural revolution that enabled these permanent settlements created new opportunities for specialization and innovation, with some individuals able to focus entirely on activities like tool-making, textile production, pottery, and religious practices rather than the immediate demands of food procurement. Many of these specialists appear to have been individuals whose social position outside traditional family structures allowed them to dedicate themselves fully to developing the technologies and artistic traditions that made complex settled life possible. The religious practices that emerged in these early settlements show clear evidence of spiritual traditions that celebrated rather than regulated human sexuality, with elaborate temples and ceremonial centers where communities gathered to participate in rituals recognizing the full spectrum of human relationships and identities. The famous temple complex at Göbekli Tepe, with its massive carved pillars depicting abstract human figures whose gender characteristics are deliberately ambiguous, may represent one of humanity's earliest architectural celebrations of gender fluidity and sexual diversity. Archaeological evidence from Neolithic settlements across the Middle East and Europe reveals sophisticated systems of trade and cultural exchange that depended heavily on individuals who could serve as intermediaries between different communities, translators and diplomats whose unique social position made them natural candidates for the complex work of maintaining peaceful relationships between settled groups with potentially competing interests. Many of these cultural ambassadors appear to have been individuals whose sexuality or gender expression placed them outside traditional family obligations, their freedom from certain social constraints making them effective negotiators and peacekeepers. The artistic traditions that flourished in these early settlements, elaborate pottery decorated with complex geometric patterns, sophisticated textile work, carved figurines that captured the full range of human forms and relationships, bear the unmistakable influence of creators whose aesthetic sensibilities were shaped by their experience of living outside conventional social categories. Their art captures not just the external world of agricultural life, but the internal world of human relationships in all their complexity, including forms of love and partnership that mainstream archaeology has only recently begun to acknowledge and study. The success of these first permanent settlements in creating stable, sustainable communities that could support increasing populations and technological innovation depended on forms of cooperation and social organization that recognized the value of every individual regardless of their conformity to statistical norms, and the inclusive social structures they developed, which made room for the full spectrum of human diversity, became part of the foundation of human civilization, preserving essential wisdom about the importance of accepting and celebrating all forms of human love and identity. As these Neolithic communities grew and eventually gave rise to the first cities and states, they carried with them social traditions and cultural values that recognized same-sex relationships and gender variance as natural and valuable aspects of human society. And although later historical developments would sometimes obscure or suppress this ancient wisdom, it never entirely disappeared, surviving in fragments and echoes that remind us that acceptance of LGBTQ+ individuals is not a modern innovation but a return to humanity's oldest and most fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. 5,000 years ago, in the fertile valleys between great rivers where the first cities were rising like dreams made manifest in mud, brick and stone, certain individuals held positions of unique authority in religious institutions that served as the spiritual and economic centers of emerging civilizations. These were the temple builders, priests and priestesses whose sacred duties included maintaining traditions of worship that recognized the full spectrum of human sexuality and gender expression as reflections of divine creativity, their own lives often embodying the fluid boundaries between male and female, human and divine, that characterized the most profound spiritual experiences. Archaeological excavations at sites like Uruk and Babylon in Mesopotamia, Memphis and Thebes in Egypt, and Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley have revealed evidence of religious practices that included elaborate ceremonies celebrating same-sex relationships and individuals who lived outside conventional gender categories. Imagine entering the great temple of Inanna in ancient Uruk, where the walls are decorated with images of the goddess's sacred marriage to partners of multiple genders, and priests whose own fluid sexuality was understood to mirror the transformative power of the divine forces they served. The cuneiform tablets and hieroglyphic inscriptions from these early civilizations preserve fragmentary but unmistakable references to religious functionaries whose spiritual authority derived partly from their embodiment of gender fluidity and alternative forms of sexuality. Individuals known by titles that have no direct modern equivalent but clearly designated them as sacred intermediaries whose very existence challenged and expanded conventional understanding of human possibility. These temple servants, many of whom appear to have lived in same-sex partnerships or outside traditional gender roles, played crucial roles in maintaining the complex ceremonial calendars and ritual practices that governed urban life. The great monuments and temple complexes built by these early civilizations required unprecedented levels of cooperation and specialized knowledge, projects that could only be completed through forms of social organization that recognized and utilized the full range of human talents and perspectives. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of the architects, engineers, and artistic directors responsible for these massive undertakings were individuals whose sexuality or gender expression placed them outside traditional family structures, their freedom from certain social obligations allowing them to dedicate themselves fully to the demanding work of creating humanity's first monumental architecture. Recent analysis of ancient texts and artistic representations has revealed that many of the deities worshipped in these early civilizations were understood to possess fluid sexuality and gender characteristics, divine beings whose creative power was thought to derive partly from their ability to transcend human categories and limitations. The worship of these deities involved elaborate ritual practices that celebrated rather than regulated human sexuality, ceremonies in which same-sex couples and gender-variant individuals played essential roles as living embodiments of divine creativity and transformation. The legal codes that emerged in these early urban civilizations, while sometimes reflecting the growing stratification and inequality of complex societies, also preserved protections and recognition for individuals whose relationships and identities differed from emerging patriarchal norms. The Code of Hammurabi and similar legal documents contain provisions that suggest same-sex partnerships and alternative gender roles retained legal standing and social recognition even as these societies became more hierarchical and institutionally complex. The trade networks that connected these early civilizations and enabled the exchange of goods, ideas, and artistic traditions across vast distances depended heavily on individuals who could serve as cultural intermediaries and diplomatic representatives, roles that were often filled by people whose sexuality or gender expression made them natural candidates for the complex work of maintaining relationships between different societies. These cultural ambassadors, many of whom lived outside traditional family structures, played crucial roles in ensuring that innovations in technology, artistic techniques, and social organizations spread rapidly throughout the ancient world. The artistic traditions that flourished in these temple-centered civilizations, elaborate sculptures and paintings that decorated religious monuments, sophisticated metalwork and jewelry that adorned both deities and their human servants, complex literary works that explored the full range of human experience, bear clear evidence of creators whose aesthetic sensibilities were shaped by their experience of living outside conventional social categories. Their art captures not just the grandeur of emerging urban civilization, but the intimate realities of human relationships in all their diversity, preserving for posterity evidence of societies that recognized and celebrated love in all its forms. As these early civilizations grew and developed the complex political and economic structures that would characterize urban life for millennia, they carried with them religious and cultural traditions that maintained space for the full spectrum of human sexuality and gender expression. And although subsequent historical developments would sometimes challenge or suppress these inclusive traditions, they never entirely disappeared, surviving in religious practices, artistic representations, and legal frameworks that continued to recognize the sacred nature of all forms of human love and identity, preserving ancient wisdom that reminds us that diversity has always been one of humanity's greatest sources of strength and creativity. As the Bronze Age dawned and human societies grew increasingly complex, spreading across continents and connecting distant lands through networks of trade and cultural exchange, certain individuals emerged as the keepers of collective memory, guardians of oral traditions and written records that preserve not just the practical knowledge necessary for survival, but the deeper wisdom about human nature that earlier generations had accumulated through millennia of lived experience. And among these memory keepers were many whose own lives embodied the diversity and complexity they worked to preserve, individuals whose sexuality and gender expression reminded their communities that human nature itself was far richer and more varied than any simple categorization could capture. The earliest written records that survive from this period, cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, hieroglyphic inscriptions from Egypt, linear scripts from the Aegean, contain scattered but unmistakable references to same-sex relationships and gender-variant individuals who held positions of respect and authority in their societies, their names and titles preserved alongside those of kings and queens, priests and merchants, artisans and warriors. Imagine a scribe in ancient Babylon, carefully recording the genealogy of a prominent family, noting without comment or judgment the same-sex partnerships and gender-fluid individuals whose contributions to their lineage were understood to be as valuable and significant as those of their conventionally gendered relatives. The great libraries and archives that emerged during this period, from the royal collections at Nineveh and Alexandria to the temple repositories of knowledge scattered across the ancient world, were maintained by individuals whose scholarly dedication and intellectual authority often derived partly from their position outside traditional family structures, their freedom from certain social obligations allowing them to dedicate themselves fully to the demanding work of preserving and organizing human knowledge. Many of these librarians and scribes appear to have lived in same-sex partnerships or outside conventional gender roles, their personal experience of diversity making them particularly sensitive to preserving records of human relationships and identities that might otherwise have been overlooked or forgotten. The epic literature that emerged during the Bronze Age, from the earliest versions of stories like Gilgamesh and the Iliad to the rich mythological traditions preserved in texts like the Egyptian pyramid texts and the Vedic hymns, contains complex and nuanced portrayals of relationships that transcend simple gender categories. Heroes and heroines whose love for companions of the same sex is presented as one of the driving forces of the narrative. These literary works, preserved and transmitted by generations of storytellers and scribes who understood the full complexity of human experience, serve as windows into societies that recognized same-sex love and gender fluidity as natural and valuable aspects of the human condition. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed the extent to which Bronze Age societies maintained sophisticated record-keeping systems that documented not just political and economic transactions but personal relationships and family structures that included same-sex partnerships and individuals who lived outside conventional gender roles. Administrative archives from sites like Kanesh in Anatolia and Pylos in Greece contain references to household arrangements and inheritance patterns that suggest these alternative forms of family and relationship were not merely tolerated but formally recognized and legally protected. The religious practices documented in Bronze Age texts reveal spiritual traditions that continued to celebrate rather than regulate human sexuality, with elaborate temple ceremonies that included same-sex couples and gender-variant individuals as essential participants in rituals designed to ensure fertility, prosperity, and divine favor. The sacred marriage ceremonies recorded in texts from across the ancient world often involved participants whose gender and sexuality transcended conventional categories, their fluid identity understood to reflect the creative power of the divine forces they served. The international diplomatic correspondence preserved in archives like those found at Amarna in Egypt reveals networks of cultural exchange that depended heavily on individuals who could serve as interpreters and cultural mediators between different societies. Roles that were often filled by people whose sexuality or gender expression made them natural candidates for the complex work of cross-cultural communication. These diplomatic agents, many of whom lived outside traditional family structures, played crucial roles in maintaining the peaceful relationships that enabled trade and cultural exchange to flourish across the Bronze Age world. The artistic traditions that reached new levels of sophistication during this period, from the elegant frescoes of Minoan Crete to the powerful sculptures of New Kingdom Egypt, show clear evidence of creators whose aesthetic sensibilities were shaped by their experience of living outside conventional social categories, their work capturing not just the formal requirements of official art, but the intimate realities of human relationships in all their diversity. And in the careful preservation of these artistic works by generations of museum keepers and cultural guardians, many of whom shared the outsider perspective of their creators, we can see how the wisdom of ancient societies about human diversity was maintained and transmitted across the centuries. As the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age and human societies continued to grow in complexity and scale, the memory keepers who had preserved essential knowledge about human nature and diversity passed their wisdom on to new generations of scholars, artists, and spiritual leaders. And although changing political and social conditions would sometimes challenge the inclusive traditions they had maintained, the fundamental understanding that human love and identity could take many forms, all of them valid and valuable, survived in the records and traditions they had so carefully preserved, continuing to remind humanity that diversity has always been one of our species' greatest strengths. 3,000 years ago, as the Bronze Age collapsed and new forms of social organization emerged from the chaos of declining empires and migrating peoples, certain individuals found themselves uniquely positioned to navigate the uncertain world that was taking shape across the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. These were the wanderers, traders and diplomats, artists and philosophers, whose freedom from traditional social obligations allowed them to move between different cultures and serve as bridges between worlds that might otherwise have remained isolated from one another, their own fluid identity and unconventional relationships, making them natural ambassadors for the diverse societies they encountered in their travels. The disruptions that marked the end of the Bronze Age, the mysterious collapse of great civilizations, the movements of sea peoples and land nomads, the breakdown of established trade networks and diplomatic relationships, created opportunities for individuals who possessed the flexibility and adaptability that came from living outside conventional social categories. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals increasing cultural exchange and innovation, much of it facilitated by people whose sexuality or gender expression made them natural intermediaries between different ways of life. The revival of trade and cultural contact that followed these disruptions was largely accomplished through the efforts of merchants and travelers who could establish trust and understanding across cultural and linguistic barriers, roles that were often filled by individuals whose own experience of living between different identity categories gave them special insight into the challenges and opportunities of cross-cultural communication. Imagine a gender-fluid trader from Phoenicia arriving at a Greek port city, their ability to embody different social roles allowing them to establish relationships with both male and female merchants, their ships carrying not just goods but ideas about human relationships and social organization that would influence the development of classical civilization. The philosophical and literary traditions that emerged during this period of cultural renewal show clear evidence of thinkers whose unconventional personal lives informed their understanding of human nature and social organization. Writers and teachers whose experience of same-sex love or gender fluidity gave them unique perspectives on questions of identity, relationship, and the good life. The works of poets like Sappho of Lesbos and philosophers, whose teachings acknowledged the full spectrum of human sexuality, gender expression were preserved and transmitted by communities of scholars and students who shared their understanding that diversity was a source of wisdom, rather than disorder. Recent analysis of personal correspondence and private documents from this period reveals networks of friendship and intellectual exchange that connected individuals across the ancient world who shared not just common interests but common experience of living outside conventional social norms, their letters and diaries preserving intimate glimpses of relationships and communities that mainstream historical sources often overlooked. These private documents, carefully preserved by individuals who understood their historical importance, provide evidence of sophisticated support networks that enabled LGBTQ+ individuals to thrive even in societies that were becoming increasingly patriarchal and restrictive. The religious innovations that characterized this period, from the mystery cults of the Mediterranean to the philosophical schools that emerged in Greece and the East, often provided spaces where individuals whose sexuality or gender expression differed from societal norms could find community and spiritual fulfillment, their alternative perspective on human relationships contributing to theological and philosophical developments that would influence Western thought for centuries. The temple communities and philosophical societies that emerged during this period preserved traditions of inclusive worship and intellectual inquiry that recognized the sacred nature of all forms of human love and identity. The artistic renaissance that accompanied the cultural revival of the Iron Age produced works of unprecedented sophistication and emotional depth, much of it created by artists whose unconventional personal lives gave them unique insight into the full range of human experience, from the lyric poetry that explored same-sex love with unprecedented frankness to the sculptural traditions that celebrated gender fluidity and sexual diversity. The art of this period reflects societies that were rediscovering ancient wisdom about the value of human diversity while developing new forms of creative expression. The political innovations that emerged during this period, from the democratic experiments of classical Athens to the cosmopolitan empires that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa, were often influenced by thinkers and leaders whose experience of living outside conventional social categories gave them special insight into questions of inclusion, representation, and social justice. The legal and political frameworks they helped develop, while sometimes reflecting the limitations of their time, also preserved protections and recognition for individuals whose relationships and identities challenged traditional norms. As the Iron Age civilizations that emerged from this period of renewal grew and developed into the great empires and cultural complexes that would dominate the ancient world, they carried with them traditions and institutions that continued to make space for human diversity in all its forms. And although subsequent historical developments would sometimes challenge these inclusive traditions, the fundamental understanding that love and identity could take many different forms, all of them valuable and worthy of respect, survived in the cultural memory of these societies, preserving ancient wisdom that would eventually contribute to modern movements for equality and human rights. As we reach the end of our journey through deep time, standing at the threshold between the prehistoric world of our ancestors and the historical civilizations that would eventually give rise to our own, we find ourselves confronted with a remarkable truth, that the human capacity for love and diversity that characterizes our modern world is not a recent development but one of the oldest and most enduring aspects of our species, a thread that connects us across the millennia to those ancient individuals who lived and loved and built the foundations of everything we now call civilization. The archaeological record we have explored, from the earliest cave paintings of Altamira to the great libraries of the Bronze Age, reveals a consistent pattern of human societies that not only tolerated but celebrated the full spectrum of gender and sexual diversity, recognizing that the strength of human communities lay not in conformity but in the rich variety of perspectives, skills, and relationships that different individuals could contribute to the collective effort of survival and cultural development. This ancient wisdom, preserved in fragmentary form across countless sites and civilizations, reminds us that the struggle for LGBTQ+ rights and recognition is not a modern invention but a return to humanity's oldest understanding of what it means to be fully human. The shamans and artists, the storytellers and memory keepers, the wanderers and temple builders whose lives we have glimpsed across 40,000 years of human history, were not exceptional figures living on the margins of their societies but integral members of communities that understood diversity as a source of strength rather than a cause for fear or discrimination. Their contributions to art and religion, to technology and social organization, to the preservation and transmission of knowledge, helped create the cultural foundations that made all subsequent human achievements possible, including the development of the very concepts of human rights and individual dignity that we take for granted today. The evidence suggests that the suppression and marginalization of LGBTQ+ individuals that characterized many societies in the historical period represented not a natural or inevitable development, but a departure from more ancient and perhaps more wise traditions of inclusion and acceptance. The patriarchal structures and rigid gender hierarchies that emerged with agriculture and urbanization, while they enabled certain forms of social organization and cultural achievement, also obscured or erased older ways of understanding human relationships and identity that recognized love and attraction as forces that transcended simple biological categories. Yet even during periods when dominant social institutions attempted to suppress or regulate sexual and gender diversity, the evidence shows that alternative traditions and underground networks continued to preserve ancient wisdom about the natural and sacred character of all forms of human love and identity. In religious communities and artistic circles, in philosophical schools and craft guilds, in the private letters and personal relationships that official histories often ignored, the understanding that humanity was enriched rather than threatened by diversity survived and was transmitted from generation to generation. The modern movement for LGBTQ+ rights and recognition, viewed from this deep historical perspective, represents not a radical departure from traditional values, but a recovery of humanity's oldest and most fundamental understanding of what it means to live together in diverse communities where every individual's capacity for love and contribution is valued and celebrated. The legal and social changes that have transformed many societies over the past century are not innovations but homecomings, returns to ways of organizing human relationships that our species had known and practiced for tens of thousands of years before historical circumstances temporarily obscured them. The individuals whose stories we have traced across the prehistoric world, from the ice priests of the Pleistocene to the temple builders of the Bronze Age, faced challenges and hardships that we can barely imagine, yet they found ways to live authentic lives and make essential contributions to their communities while maintaining relationships and identities that remind us that human love has always been capable of transcending every boundary and limitation. Their courage and creativity, their ability to find meaning and connection even in the face of extinction-level challenges, provides inspiration and guidance for contemporary struggles for acceptance and equality. As we consider the lessons that this deep history might offer for our own time, we are reminded that the human capacity for both love and prejudice, for both inclusion and exclusion, represents choices rather than inevitabilities. Cultural decisions that each generation must make based on their understanding of what it means to be human and what kinds of communities they want to create for themselves and their descendants. The archaeological record suggests that societies that embraced diversity and celebrated the full spectrum of human relationships were often more creative, more resilient, and more successful at meeting the challenges they faced than those that attempted to suppress or regulate natural human variation. The story of the first gay caveman, and of all the countless individuals whose lives and loves we have glimpsed across 40 millennia of human experience, is ultimately the story of humanity itself in all its beautiful complexity and diversity. It is the story of our species' long journey from small bands of hunter-gatherers struggling to survive in an Ice Age world to global civilizations capable of unprecedented creativity and cooperation, a journey that was made possible not despite our diversity, but because of it, not in spite of the different ways we love and identify, but because of the strength and resilience that such diversity provides. And so we come to the end of this journey through deep time, having followed the footsteps of our ancestors across 40,000 years of human experience, witnessing their struggles and celebrations, their innovations and discoveries, their loves and losses that collectively created the foundation of everything we now call civilization. We have seen how the capacity for diverse forms of love and identity has been with our species from the very beginning, not as an aberration or departure from some imagined norm, but as one of the fundamental aspects of human nature that enabled our ancestors to survive and thrive in environments that challenged every aspect of their existence. The silence of these ancient places, the caves and burial grounds, the temple sites and abandoned settlements where our ancestors lived and loved and died, speaks to us across the millennia with a message that is both simple and profound, that humanity has always been diverse, that love has always taken many forms, and that the strength of human communities has always depended on their ability to recognize and celebrate the full spectrum of human experience rather than attempting to constrain it within narrow categories of acceptability. In the handprints pressed into clay in prehistoric caves, in the careful arrangement of grave goods around ancient burials, in the artistic representations and religious practices that acknowledged the sacred nature of all forms of human relationship, we can still feel the presence of individuals whose lives remind us that the struggle for acceptance and equality is not a modern invention, but the continuation of humanity's oldest conversation about what it means to live together in communities where every person's capacity for love and contribution is valued and celebrated. As you continue on your own journey, wherever in the world you might be listening to these words, whatever time of day or night has brought you to this exploration of our shared human heritage, remember that you are connected by bonds of kinship and understanding to those ancient ancestors whose lives we have glimpsed across the vast expanse of deep time, their courage in living authentic lives despite the challenges they faced, their contributions to the cultural and technological achievements that made all subsequent human progress possible, their commitment to preserving and transmitting wisdom about the natural and sacred character of human diversity, continues to inspire and guide us as we work to create communities where every individual can flourish regardless of how they love or how they identify. The story of humanity is far from over, and each of us has a role to play in determining what the next chapters will contain. Will we choose to honor the ancient wisdom that recognized diversity as a source of strength, or will we allow fear and prejudice to diminish our capacity for creating inclusive communities where every person can contribute their unique gifts to the collective human project? The choice, as it has always been, remains ours to make. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the deep history of human love and identity. If this exploration has moved or inspired you, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you are listening from, and what aspects of this ancient story resonate most strongly with your own experience. And remember that in celebrating the diversity of our ancestors, we honor not just their memory, but our own potential to create a world where every form of human love is recognized as sacred, every individual's contribution is valued, and every person's right to live authentically is protected and celebrated. Until we meet again in our next journey through the vast landscape of human experience, may you carry with you the knowledge that you are part of an unbroken chain of love and creativity that stretches back to the very dawn of our species, and that the choices you make about how to live and love and contribute to your community are part of humanity's ongoing conversation about what it means to be fully human in a world of infinite possibility and wonder.